In November 1942, the German army believed it was on the edge of victory in the city of Stalingrad. For months, brutal fighting had consumed the ruins along the Volga River. Entire divisions were reduced to a few hundred exhausted soldiers. Streets, factories, and even staircases had changed hands dozens of times. Yet, despite the horrific cost, Adolf Hitler insisted that the capture of Stalingrad would break Soviet resistance and secure Germany's position on the Eastern Front. Inside the shattered city, General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army continued pushing forward, convinced that Soviet forces were close to collapse. But far beyond the ruined factories and burning apartment blocks, the Soviet High Command was preparing something very different. For weeks, Soviet commanders had quietly moved fresh armies into position north and south of Stalingrad. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and nearly 1,000,000 soldiers were gathering in secret. Instead of attacking the heavily defended German troops inside the city, the Soviets aimed for the weaker flanks protecting them. These positions were held not by German divisions, but by Allied Romanian units, which were poorly equipped and stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of frozen steppe. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the silence of the winter steppe shattered. Soviet artillery opened one of the largest bombardments of the entire war. Thousands of guns fired at once, turning the Romanian defensive lines into chaos. Within hours, Soviet tank columns surged forward through snow and smoke. Romanian soldiers fought desperately, but their anti-tank weapons were outdated and ineffective against the advancing Soviet armor. Entire defensive sectors collapsed in a single day. Communication broke down, units were cut off, and gaps opened that quickly widened into massive breaches. The next day, November 20th, Soviet forces attacked again, this time south of Stalingrad. The same pattern repeated itself. Another Romanian army guarding the German flank was overwhelmed by Soviet tanks and mechanized infantry. Within 48 hours, the Soviet plan, known as Operation Uranus, was working exactly as intended. Instead of attacking the Germans directly in the city, Soviet forces were racing around them, moving westward across the open steppe. Inside Stalingrad, German commanders began receiving disturbing reports. Entire Allied formations had disappeared from the map. Soviet armored units were advancing rapidly through the rear areas where supply depots and communication centers were located. At first, many German officers believed these reports were exaggerated or temporary setbacks. But as the hours passed, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, quickly realized the danger. His army was deep inside Stalingrad, with its supply routes stretching hundreds of kilometers across exposed territory. If Soviet forces managed to link up behind him, the entire army could be surrounded. Paulus immediately began sending urgent messages to Army Group headquarters and to the German High Command. He warned that the situation on the flanks was deteriorating rapidly and requested permission to withdraw his forces from the city before the encirclement was completed. But decisions about retreat were not made by Paulus. On the Eastern Front, those decisions belonged to Adolf Hitler. For Hitler, Stalingrad had become far more than a strategic objective. The city carried the name of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. Capturing it would deliver an enormous symbolic victory. Hitler had repeatedly declared that the city would fall, and he had no intention of abandoning it now. Reports of collapsing flanks were dismissed as temporary problems that German reserves would soon stabilize. Meanwhile, the Soviet tank columns kept moving. Across the frozen plains west of Stalingrad, Soviet mechanized forces advanced with remarkable speed.
German rear area units were caught completely unprepared. Supply trucks, fuel depots, and communication centers fell one after another. Many German officers only realized what was happening when Soviet tanks appeared on roads they believed were safely behind the front lines. On November 23rd, only 4 days after the offensive began, Soviet forces from the north and south finally met near the town of Kalach on the Don River. With that link-up, the trap was closed. Inside the newly formed ring were more than 250,000 German soldiers, along with thousands of Romanian, Croatian, and other Axis troops. Tanks, artillery, supply vehicles, wounded soldiers, and entire headquarters staffs were now trapped together in a massive pocket stretching across the ruins of Stalingrad and the surrounding steppe. For the men inside the pocket, the realization came slowly. At first, many believed the encirclement would be temporary. German armored forces had broken Soviet lines before. Surely relief would come quickly. But as days passed, the situation grew more alarming. Roads leading west were cut. Supply convoys disappeared. Radio reports confirmed what many already feared. The Sixth Army was completely surrounded. General Paulus again contacted the High Command. His army, he explained, was not prepared for a long siege. Most of the supplies were still located outside the pocket. Ammunition stocks were limited, fuel reserves were dangerously low, and winter clothing for many soldiers had never arrived. He requested immediate permission to break out while his army still had enough strength to attempt it. The request reached Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The answer came quickly. There would be no breakout. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to remain in Stalingrad and hold its positions. He believed that German forces outside the pocket would soon launch a counterattack and reopen the supply lines. Retreat, in his view, would turn a temporary crisis into a permanent defeat. The city must be held at all costs. Inside the pocket, Paulus and his staff studied the maps in growing concern. Every hour that passed allowed the Soviets to strengthen their encirclement. Defensive lines were being constructed. Fresh Soviet divisions were moving into position. The window for escape was closing rapidly. But Hitler's order was absolute. Now the trapped army faced a terrifying new reality. More than 250,000 men were isolated hundreds of kilometers inside enemy territory as winter tightened its grip on the Russian steppe. Temperatures were already dropping far below freezing. Food stocks were limited. Fuel for vehicles and generators was running out. Horses were already being slaughtered to supplement rations. The central question facing the German High Command was suddenly unavoidable. How could such a massive force be supplied? Every day, the Sixth Army required enormous amounts of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel simply to survive. The number was staggering. Hundreds of tons would be needed daily just to keep the army functioning at a minimal level. Delivering such quantities across Soviet-controlled territory seemed almost impossible. Yet abandoning the army was equally unthinkable. The destruction of the Sixth Army would be one of the greatest military disasters in German history. As German leaders searched for solutions, attention turned towards one man who believed he had the answer. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Luftwaffe, had built his reputation on bold claims and dramatic promises. His air force had once stunned the world with lightning strikes across Europe. Now, Göring was about to make a promise that would shape the fate of every soldier trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket. A promise that the Luftwaffe could keep the entire army alive.
Chapter 2. The Impossible Promise. By the last days of November 1942, the reality of the Stalingrad disaster was beginning to reach the highest levels of the German command. The Sixth Army was surrounded, its supply lines cut, its soldiers trapped in a frozen pocket hundreds of kilometers inside Soviet territory. Maps arriving at Hitler's headquarters confirmed that Soviet forces had sealed the ring completely. What had begun as a sudden crisis was now becoming a strategic catastrophe. Inside the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia, known as the Wolf's Lair, the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. Hitler had always believed that his willpower alone could overcome military setbacks. Retreat, in his mind, was a sign of weakness. Since the beginning of the war, he had repeatedly ordered German forces to stand their ground no matter the cost. Now, that same philosophy was about to face one of its most dangerous tests. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus continued sending urgent radio messages from inside the Stalingrad pocket. His staff had calculated the daily requirements for the army's survival. The numbers were alarming. The Sixth Army needed enormous quantities of supplies just to function: food for hundreds of thousands of men, ammunition for artillery and machine guns, fuel for vehicles, medical equipment for the wounded, winter clothing for soldiers facing temperatures that could fall below -30 degrees Celsius. The minimum requirement, according to Paulus's calculations, was around 500 tons of supplies every single day. Without that amount, the army would slowly starve, freeze, and run out of ammunition. Under normal circumstances, delivering such quantities would require constant truck convoys moving along secure supply routes, but those routes no longer existed. The Soviet army controlled the entire region surrounding the pocket. Any attempt to drive supplies through would be destroyed long before reaching the trapped soldiers. This left only one possible solution: the supplies would have to come from the air. The idea of supplying large forces by aircraft was not completely new. Earlier battles in the war had the German Luftwaffe successfully delivered supplies to isolated units for short periods of time. Aircraft had also evacuated wounded soldiers and transported ammunition to forward airfields, but never before had an entire army been dependent solely on air supply. The scale required at Stalingrad was unlike anything attempted in military history. Despite this, the question soon reached the man responsible for Germany's air force, Hermann Göring. Göring was one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany. A decorated fighter pilot during the First World War, he had become the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest associates. Over the years, he had gained the reputation for confidence, ambition, and enormous personal pride. His uniform was covered with medals, and he enjoyed the image of himself as a bold and decisive leader. When the question of supplying the Sixth Army by air was raised, Göring was not initially present at the meeting. Instead, Hitler contacted him by telephone and asked a direct question: could the Luftwaffe supply the encircled army from the air? For a moment, Göring faced a decision that would affect the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. If he answered honestly, he might have told Hitler that such an operation would be nearly impossible. The Luftwaffe was already stretched thin across multiple fronts. Many transport aircraft had been lost earlier in the war. Winter weather over southern Russia was unpredictable and dangerous. Soviet fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses were becoming stronger. Even under ideal conditions, delivering 500 tons of supplies every day would require an enormous fleet of transport planes flying constantly without interruption. But honesty carried risks. In Hitler's inner circle, contradicting the leader could destroy careers. Generals who questioned his decisions often found themselves dismissed or ignored. Göring understood that Hitler wanted reassurance, not doubt. The army was surrounded, and Hitler needed to believe that the situation could still be controlled. So Göring gave the answer Hitler wanted to hear: yes.
He assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army entirely by air. The transport aircraft of the Luftwaffe, he claimed, would deliver the necessary 500 tons of supplies every day until the encirclement was broken. The trapped army would hold its ground while relief forces fought their way toward Stalingrad. Inside the Luftwaffe command structure, however, the reaction was very different. Experienced officers who understood the capabilities of German transport aviation quickly realized that Göring's promise was dangerously unrealistic. The Luftwaffe simply did not possess enough aircraft to deliver such massive quantities every day. The main transport plane available was the Junkers Ju-52, a reliable but relatively slow aircraft that could carry only a limited amount of cargo. Even if every available transport plane was assigned to the mission, the numbers barely approached the required capacity, and those calculations assumed perfect conditions. In reality, winter storms frequently covered the region in snow and ice. Airfields inside the pocket were small and vulnerable to Soviet artillery. Aircraft landing at these airstrips risked being destroyed before they could unload their cargo. Soviet fighter aircraft were also becoming increasingly active, attacking German transports as they approached the pocket. Many Luftwaffe officers quietly tried to warn their superiors that the operation might fail. Some suggested that the army should still attempt a breakout while it had the strength to do so, but those warnings struggled to move upward through the chain of command. Göring had already made his promise directly to Hitler, and challenging it now would mean admitting that the Luftwaffe commander had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Instead, preparations for the massive airlift began. Across occupied Europe, transport aircraft were gathered and redirected towards the Eastern Front. Crews were ordered to prepare for continuous flights into the Stalingrad pocket. Airfields closer to the front were expanded to handle the increasing traffic. Fuel depots were stocked, mechanics worked night and day to keep aircraft operational, and new flight schedules were created. On paper, the plan seemed bold and decisive, but numbers began to tell a different story. Even under optimistic calculations, the Luftwaffe could realistically deliver perhaps 100 to 150 tons of supplies per day. That was only a fraction of the 500 tons the Army required. And those numbers did not yet account for losses caused by weather, mechanical failures, or Soviet attacks. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the soldiers of the Sixth Army waited for the first aircraft to arrive. They listened for the distant sound of engines in the freezing sky, hoping the promised lifeline would appear. Far away at Hitler's headquarters, Göring's promise had already shaped the next decision. Because the airlift was expected to succeed, the army would not attempt a breakout. It would stay exactly where it was. For the hundreds of thousands of men trapped inside Stalingrad, their survival now depended entirely on the success of a promise that never truly was possible.
Chapter 3: The Airlift That Never Worked. As November turned into December 1942, the fate of the German Sixth Army depended on a constant stream of aircraft flying into the shrinking Stalingrad pocket. Every day, hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited for the distant sound of engines in the sky. Those aircraft were now their only connection to the outside world. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, everything had to arrive through the air. The airlift began almost immediately after the encirclement was confirmed. Luftwaffe transport planes gathered at airfields across southern Russia and Ukraine, preparing for the most ambitious aerial supply operation of the war. Pilots were ordered to fly repeated missions into the pocket, landing at the few airstrips still under German control. The most important of these airfields was Pitomnik, located a few kilometers west of Stalingrad. Another airstrip at Gumrak would also play a crucial role. From these frozen runways, the entire lifeline of the Sixth Army would operate. The first flights arrived carrying food, ammunition, and small quantities of fuel. Wounded soldiers were loaded onto the returning aircraft whenever space allowed. At first, there was a brief sense of relief inside the pocket. The promised supply operation had begun. Aircraft were arriving. The connection to the outside world still existed. But the numbers arriving with those planes quickly revealed a troubling truth. On paper, the Luftwaffe had promised 500 tons of supplies every day. In reality, the daily deliveries were far smaller. Some days, barely 100 tons reached the trapped army. On other days, the number fell even lower. Bad weather frequently grounded aircraft before they could take off. Thick fog and snowstorms made navigation across the steppe extremely dangerous. The pilots flying these missions faced conditions unlike almost any other air operation during the war. Winter storms could appear suddenly, covering airfields in ice and snow. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Instruments froze, engines struggled in the extreme cold, and aircraft sometimes crashed simply trying to land on icy runways. Even when the weather allowed flights to continue, other dangers waited in the sky. Soviet fighter aircraft had begun patrolling the approaches to the Stalingrad pocket. German transport planes were slow and heavily loaded with cargo, making them easy targets. Soviet pilots quickly learned the routes used by the Luftwaffe and began intercepting them regularly. Anti-aircraft guns around the pocket also opened fire on the approaching aircraft, filling the sky with explosions as the transports attempted to land. Many planes never returned. Some crashed on frozen fields after being damaged by Soviet fighters. Others vanished in snowstorms. Still more were destroyed while landing or taking off from the overcrowded airfields inside the pocket. The Luftwaffe was losing valuable aircraft and experienced crews at a pace that could not be easily replaced. Despite these losses, the airlift continued. Every available transport plane was pressed into service. The reliable but aging Junkers U-52 formed the backbone of the operation. Other aircraft that had never been designed as cargo transports were also forced into the mission. Bombers were stripped of their weapons and converted into supply carriers. Even small training aircraft were sometimes used to carry tiny loads of ammunition or medicine. Yet even with all these efforts, the gap between what was needed and what was delivered kept growing. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the consequences became visible almost immediately. Food rations were reduced again and again. Soldiers who had once received full meals were now surviving on thin soup, bread, and whatever could be scavenged from the ruins of the city. Horses that had once pulled artillery or supply wagons were slaughtered to provide additional meat. Fuel shortages created another serious problem. Tanks and trucks inside the pocket could no longer move freely. Vehicles were often abandoned simply because there was no gasoline left to operate them. Artillery units struggled to receive enough ammunition to maintain their defensive fire. Hospitals inside the pocket quickly became overwhelmed. Thousands of wounded soldiers required evacuation, but aircraft arriving at the airfields had limited space. Some of the most severely injured men were carried onto transport planes and flown out of the pocket, but many others had to remain behind. Field hospitals were forced to operate with shrinking supplies of bandages, medicine, and surgical equipment. At the Luftwaffe command centers outside the pocket, daily reports began to tell a grim story. The promised 500 tons per day remained completely out of reach. On rare occasions, the airlift managed to deliver around 200 tons. Most days it was far less. Weather delays, aircraft losses, and logistical problems constantly reduced the numbers.
The average deliveries remained far below the level needed to sustain the army. Still, the operation continued. Pilots flew multiple missions each day, sometimes barely sleeping between flights. Mechanics worked through freezing nights to repair damaged engines and prepare aircraft for the next mission. Ground crews loaded supplies as quickly as possible, knowing that every minute of delay meant fewer flights reaching the pocket. Many of the men involved understood that the operation was failing, but the promise had already been made. Back at Hitler's headquarters, the reports arriving from the front were often presented in the most optimistic terms possible. Deliveries were sometimes exaggerated or averaged in ways that made the situation appear more manageable than it really was. The hope remained that the airlift could continue just long enough for German ground forces to launch a relief operation from outside the pocket. But inside Stalingrad, the men living in the ruins of the city could feel the truth every day. The supplies arriving from the sky were not enough. As December advanced, temperatures dropped even lower across the frozen steppe. Snow covered the destroyed buildings of the city. The men of the Sixth Army wrapped themselves in blankets, scraps of clothing, and captured Soviet uniforms in desperate attempts to stay warm. They continued to look upward whenever they heard aircraft approaching. Each plane carried hope: crates of food, boxes of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and sometimes letters from home. But with every passing week, fewer aircraft appeared in the sky. The massive airlift that had been promised as the salvation of the Sixth Army was slowly revealing its true limits, and the men trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket were beginning to understand that the lifeline keeping them alive was far weaker than anyone had been told.
As December 1942 turned into January 1943, the situation inside the Stalingrad pocket continued to deteriorate with alarming speed. What had once been a vast encircled battlefield was now slowly tightening into a smaller and smaller space. Soviet forces surrounding the pocket were no longer simply holding their lines, they were preparing to crush the trapped German army completely. For the soldiers of the Sixth Army, every day now followed the same grim pattern. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion dominated daily life. Food rations had already been reduced several times, and now they were barely enough to keep a man alive. Bread was cut into smaller and smaller portions. Soup often contained little more than water and a few scraps of meat or vegetables. Horses had long since disappeared from the streets of the pocket, having been slaughtered for food weeks earlier. The winter cold was relentless. Temperatures frequently dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing because supply convoys carrying winter gear had been cut off before reaching the pocket. Frostbite became as common as battle wounds. Fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs were lost to the cold. At night, the men huddled inside ruined buildings or dugouts carved into the frozen ground. Fires were rare because fuel was scarce and smoke could attract Soviet artillery fire. Blankets were shared, and men slept close together simply to stay alive through the long, freezing nights. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were tightening their grip around the pocket. Throughout December, the Red Army continued to strengthen its positions around the encircled German army. Fresh divisions arrived with tanks, artillery, and infantry reinforcements. Soviet commanders were determined not to repeat earlier mistakes where German armies had broken through encirclements. This time, the ring would be sealed completely. Outside the pocket, German commanders attempted to a relief operation. A powerful armored force under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched an offensive toward Stalingrad in mid-December. The goal was to break through Soviet lines and reopen a corridor to the trapped Sixth Army. For a brief moment,
Hope returned to the German soldiers inside the pocket. Reports reached them that German tanks were advancing from the southwest. But the distance between the relief force and the trapped army remained enormous. Paulus requested permission to attempt a breakout toward the approaching German forces. His army still had some tanks and vehicles that might be able to fight their way west if they moved quickly. But once again, the decision did not belong to him. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army was ordered to remain exactly where it was. The city of Stalingrad was to be held as a fortress. Hitler believed that Manstein's forces would eventually break through and reach the pocket. Until then, Paulus and his soldiers were expected to defend their positions and wait. Inside the pocket, many officers understood that this decision sealed their fate. The army no longer had the fuel necessary for a large-scale breakout. Even if such an attempt were ordered, many vehicles could not move. Horses were gone, trucks stood frozen without gasoline, and tanks were often abandoned simply because they could not be refueled. The opportunity to escape had existed weeks earlier. Now it was rapidly disappearing. At the same time, the airlift that had been promised as the army's lifeline was becoming weaker every day. The airfields inside the pocket were now among the most important locations in the entire battlefield. Pitomnik Airfield had become the central hub for the airlift. Every day, transport planes attempted to land there, unloading supplies and evacuating wounded soldiers. Thousands of injured men waited nearby, hoping to secure a seat on one of the departing aircraft. But Soviet artillery had begun targeting the airfield relentlessly. Shells frequently exploded across the runways, destroying aircraft and killing ground crews. Pilots landing at Pitomnik often faced the terrifying sight of burning wreckage scattered across the snow. Some planes crashed simply because the damaged runway was too dangerous for safe landing. Despite the danger, the flights continued. The wounded were carried onto aircraft whenever possible, many of them barely conscious from injuries or exposure to the cold. Others waited for days, sometimes weeks, hoping their turn would come. Then, in January 1943, the situation took another devastating turn. Soviet forces launched a powerful offensive designed to destroy the pocket once and for all. The attack, known as Operation Ring, began with massive artillery bombardments, followed by coordinated infantry and tank assaults. German defensive lines, already weakened by starvation and lack of ammunition, struggled to hold. Slowly, the pocket began to shrink. German units were forced to retreat deeper into the ruined city. Positions that once had been far from the front lines suddenly found themselves under direct attack. Entire divisions were reduced to small groups of exhausted survivors. Then came the loss that would cripple the airlift completely. On January 16th, Soviet troops captured Pitomnik Airfield. The fall of Pitomnik was a catastrophic blow for the Sixth Army. It had been the main airstrip capable of handling large transport aircraft. Without it, the already struggling airlift would become even more limited. Only the smaller airfield at Gumrak remained in German hands, and it was already under heavy Soviet pressure. The scenes at Pitomnik during its final days were chaotic and desperate. Thousands of wounded soldiers crowded the airfield, hoping to escape before it fell. Aircraft landed under artillery fire, quickly loading as many men as possible before taking off again. Many wounded soldiers were left behind, simply because there was no space. When Soviet troops finally captured the airfield, those remaining wounded soldiers were taken prisoner. Now the airlift faced impossible conditions. Aircraft had to land at Gumrak, which was much smaller and increasingly dangerous. Soviet artillery and fighters continued attacking the transports, and the shrinking pocket meant fewer safe landing areas. Deliveries dropped even further. Inside the pocket, starvation reached critical levels. Soldiers searched abandoned buildings for scraps of food. Some boiled leather belts or pieces of horse harness to create a weak broth. Medical supplies were nearly gone, and hospitals could do little more than offer shelter to the wounded. Every day, the map of the pocket grew smaller. General Paulus continued sending reports to the German High Command, describing the hopeless conditions. Ammunition nearly exhausted. Many soldiers were too weak from hunger to fight effectively. Temperatures remained brutally cold. The army could not survive much longer. Yet even now, the orders from Hitler remained unchanged. The Sixth Army was to hold her ground. For the men trapped inside Stalingrad, the final stage of the disaster was approaching. The once powerful German army that had marched across Europe now found itself reduced to a starving, freezing force trapped among the ruins of a destroyed city. And above them, the sky that once carried their lifeline was growing quieter with each passing day.
Chapter 5. The Price of a Promise. By the end of January 1943, the once massive Stalingrad pocket had been crushed into a small area of frozen ruins along the Volga River. What had once been a powerful army of more than 200,000 men was now a starving, exhausted force struggling simply to survive each passing day. Ammunition was almost gone. Food had nearly disappeared. Many soldiers were too weak from hunger and cold to even stand. The airlift that had once been presented as the salvation of the Sixth Army had almost completely collapsed. After the loss of Potomac and later the capture of Gumrak Airfield, large transport aircraft could no longer land inside the pocket. Only occasional supply drops were attempted, and even those rarely reached the soldiers who needed them. Most of the crates fell into Soviet-controlled territory or were destroyed in the fighting. For the men trapped inside the ruins of Stalingrad, the sound of aircraft engines had become rare. The sky that once carried hope now remained mostly silent. Soviet forces continued their relentless advance, dividing the remaining German troops into smaller and smaller pockets. Artillery fire pounded the ruined city day and night. Soviet infantry and tanks pushed forward through shattered buildings and frozen streets, steadily reducing what remained of the German defenses. General Friedrich Paulus and his staff had moved their headquarters into the basement of a department store in the center of the city. The building itself was heavily damaged, its upper floors shattered by months of bombardment. Inside the dark underground rooms, Paulus and his officers studied maps that showed a situation growing hopeless with every hour. The army was now divided into northern and southern groups, separated by Soviet forces. Communication between them was becoming increasingly difficult. Entire divisions had ceased to exist as organized units. What remained were scattered groups of soldiers holding isolated positions with little ammunition and almost no food. In Berlin and at Hitler's headquarters, the scale of the disaster was impossible to ignore. The Sixth Army, once one of the most powerful formations in the German military, was on the verge of destruction. But even now, Hitler refused to authorize surrender. Instead, he made one final decision. On January 30th, 1943, Adolf Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. At first glance, the promotion appeared to be an honor, but the message behind it was clear. In German military tradition, no field marshal had ever surrendered to the enemy. By giving Paulus this rank at the very moment his army was collapsing, Hitler was sending an unmistakable signal. He expected Paulus to fight to the death. Many officers inside the headquarters understood the meaning immediately. Hitler believed that Paulus would either continue resisting until the last man or take his own life rather than surrender.
Either outcome would avoid the humiliation of a German field marshal being captured alive. But Paulus himself had reached a very different conclusion. By this stage, the soldiers under his command were no longer capable of continuing the fight. Many were wounded, starving, or suffering from severe frostbite. Hospitals were overflowing with men who could not even walk. Ammunition stocks were almost completely exhausted, and Soviet forces were already moving through large sections of the ruined city. Continuing the battle would serve no military purpose. It would only lead to the pointless deaths of the few remaining survivors. On the morning of January 31, 1943, Soviet troops advanced into the area surrounding Paulus's headquarters. German resistance in that sector had largely collapsed. A Soviet officer entered the basement command post and found the exhausted German field marshal surrounded by his staff. Friedrich Paulus surrendered. For the first time in history, a German field marshal had been captured alive by enemy forces. The northern group of German troops inside the pocket continued fighting for 2 more days, but their situation was even worse. Completely cut off and lacking almost all supplies, they could not resist the Soviet assault for long. On February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance inside Stalingrad finally ended. The battle that had raged for months was over. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Of roughly 300,000 Axis soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, only a small fraction would ever return home. Tens of thousands had died during the battle itself, from combat, starvation, disease, and exposure to the freezing winter. Around 90,000 exhausted survivors were taken prisoner by the Soviet army. For most of them, captivity would be long and brutal. Many would die in Soviet prison camps in the years that followed. Only a few thousand eventually returned to Germany after the war ended. The destruction of the Sixth Army marked one of the greatest turning points of the Second World War. For the first time, an entire German field army had been destroyed. The myth of German invincibility on the Eastern Front had been shattered. Across Europe and around the world, the name Stalingrad became a symbol of catastrophic defeat. In the aftermath of the battle, many German commanders and historians looked back at the decisions that had led to this disaster. Among them, one moment stood out above all others: the promise that the trapped army could be supplied by air. Hermann Göring had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies every day to sustain the Sixth Army. In reality, the operation had never come close to that number. Weather, distance, limited aircraft, Soviet fighters, and the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front had made the promise impossible from the very beginning. Yet once the promise had been made, it shaped every decision that followed. Because Hitler believed the airlift would succeed, he refused to allow the army to break out when escape was still possible. Because the army remained in place, the Soviet encirclement tightened until survival became impossible. And because no one in the inner circle dared to challenge the promise directly, the illusion continued long after the reality had become obvious. In the end, the Stalingrad disaster was not caused by a single mistake, but a chain of decisions built on pride, loyalty, and the refusal to accept unpleasant truths. Hundreds of thousands of men paid the price for that chain of decisions. And at the center of it all stood one promise that had been impossible to keep.